Welcome to Character Explorations, a podcast production of the Wendt Center for Character Education at the University of Dubuque. I'm Annalee Ward, the director of the Wendt Center. Our guests today include Assistant Professor of Language and Literature, Michele McKinlay, who will moderate the discussion with Dr. Jonathan Barz, Professor of Language and Literature, and UD student Katrina Owensby. They'll be discussing the question, if the author is a model of bad character, does it matter? Welcome all.
Thank you, Annalee. When I Googled problematic authors and question of character, I got over 1 million hits. The list is endless and includes traditional canonical authors such as Dickens, Carroll, Eliot, Orwell, Stein, Hemingway, Pound, O'Connor, and contemporary authors such as Alexis Diaz and Rowling, among others. It seems like every week we read about another writer whose bad choices have been unearthed, often through their own words, more often through accusations from victims and scathing critical essays. As consumers of stories, we may feel disappointed or outraged when a favorite writer stands accused. As educators, we face the dilemma of whether to continue teaching a problematic text or writer, or discarding them in favor of someone less problematic. I'm joined today by Dr. John Barz, Professor of Language and Literature at UD, and Ms. Katrina Owensby, a senior majoring in English and English education. Welcome to you both. So, I recently heard someone discuss their complicated bookcase, filled with works by authors whose characters may be questioned, and I wonder what works are on your bookshelves. Katrina?
I have one of the books we read in adolescent literature. It was The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, and every single time I pick that book up, I remember your introduction saying, okay, Sherman Alexie's not a great guy, but there's a lot to learn from this book.
Yeah, I'm glad I said that. John, I imagine you have the same?
Yeah, and Alexie jumps right to mind. So I don't know if we need to fill in some background. Sherman Alexie is a rock star of a Native American novelist, short story writer, poet. He's charismatic, he's funny, he's apparently attractive, and he, at least during one point in his life, was a predator towards females and especially aspiring young female Native American authors, where he abused the power that he had by virtue of his status. I'm teaching Native American literature this fall, and yesterday I put in my book list and I included Alexie. And I thought back to the last time I taught the course was in 2018, right after that news broke, right after he was exposed for being predatory in various ways. And that class began with a conversation. And I was completely open to the possibility that we might just yank him from the reading list at that point. So can I ask Katrina, what would you have recommended? Should I yank him this fall yet?
I feel like if you yank an author because you believe that they exhibit bad character, is that denying the idea that they might have good qualities as well? Because if you say somebody is bad character, are they an absolutely bad person? Is there an absolute to somebody's character? And that's the question we have to ponder before we try to yank somebody from class.
And that brings up a really good question. Can we separate authors from their works? Is the act of writing so intimate, too intimate to not reveal the author's character? Or can we say, well, the story's great, the writer is bad, but do we then start looking for those clues? I know, John, you mentioned Hemingway earlier today, and we know so much about Hemingway's life, we start to look for these clues in the works. And so I don't know what your thoughts are, if we can separate the works from the authors.
There's a line from William Butler Yeats, his poem Among School Children, that always comes to mind here. The poem ends with these two lines: "O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance?" And now, that's sort of interesting, because with dance we maybe are less concerned about the character, because we're not dealing in language and ideas in the same kind of way. But it's that question, right? Like, where's the boundary between the person who creates this and the created thing? If we could dial the clock back 50 years and all be new critics, there's no problem, right? We would just go, it's an artifact, it's a Grecian urn, it's a thing we can talk about, and the author has nothing to do with it. But we mostly don't think that way anymore about texts and authors, at least not so sharply divided. So these are hard questions. I was really looking forward to this conversation, because I don't feel like I have these answers all pat, and there are things that I'm wrestling with course by course. And I am planning to teach a course, you'll be in it, Katrina, on Ernest Hemingway this fall. A deeply flawed man. So,
sort of coming off that idea is, we think of these sort of canonical authors, the Hemingways, Lewis Carroll, Dickens even, who's been sort of put on the list, and we say, well, but they lived in a certain time. They lived in a certain era, things were different then. So I'm wondering, authors today, or even in the last 10 years, who we sort of say, well, you should have known better, right? We live in a different time. What do we do with those Hemingways, those authors who, do we excuse them? Do we give them a free ride? Is that fair to current authors? What about Dr. Seuss, who, to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, the book that's been in the news a lot, with anti-Asian depictions, stereotypes, very harsh, written in 1936. So do we say, well, that was then, this is now?
That's a debate that's been going on in social media a lot lately that I've noticed. There was a segment on SNL Weekend Update when Pete Davidson was talking about the whole R. Kelly thing. And he said something along the lines of, if we're looking for perfection in all of our artists, our authors, our actors, we're not going to have anything to listen to read, to watch, because nobody's perfect.
Yeah, and I think we've got to start by recognizing the fallenness of humankind. So perfection's not a possibility, and everything that we read is going to be written by a flawed human being. Some people are more flawed than others, and some people are flawed in ways that cause more harm. Which is one of the interesting things I find about this debate, is it tends to be rather narrowly focused, right? We're not concerned so much about authors who were bad fathers. We're concerned about racism, rightly so, because it's something that is so crucial for us to sort through in our society. We're concerned about sexual aggression. But there's lots of other ways people are bad. And if we go back, 90 years, this kind of cancellation was all politically directed, and it was directed towards those who espoused communism, right? Should we teach Langston Hughes? Right? He was sympathetic to communism. He did a tour of the Soviet Union and was entranced by what he saw. Right? That conversation's gone, because that's not what we're concerned about right now. But I think we can also look back on it and see it as rather wrong-headed. So we always have to wonder what seems so clear to us. Will it look the same way in 50 years or whatever?
Well, and that brings up the question of, if an author in question has apologized, has attempted to atone for their past actions and words, what do we do with them then? And certainly deceased authors don't have a chance to do that. Can we find ways to practice compassion to both the author, but also recognizing and not minimizing the harm done to victims? Again, with Alexei, who said, yeah, I'm all that, there's been a sense of, well, how sincere are you? Does that give you a pass? Can we practice compassion with some of these flawed people? Is it by recognizing their frailty, as you mentioned, or what your thoughts are on that?
I feel like the foundation of classroom readings is maybe recognizing, okay, this was not a good person, but their work can teach us a lot. Separation of sin versus sinner and author versus work is going to be integral to all of our literature teachings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I do think Christian language is useful here, right? When we talk about human fallenness, through a Christian lens, we don't expect anything else. But then we also have that room to practice grace. Ultimately, as a teacher, I think I need to be fair to the texts I'm teaching. What's there? What does it open up for us? How does it help us to see the world? But I need to be fair to my students too, in terms of I believe that texts affect people. That's why what I do matters, right? It's not just this body of data or something that you're taking in, but it's shaping your worldview. It's helping us. It's giving us lenses through which we see the world. It's not neutral. I love the literary critic Wayne Booth, a long time at University of Chicago, had a book called The Company We Keep, and it was about ethical literary criticism. But just the metaphor of the title, that books are the company we keep, right? And I'm a parent, I raised 3 kids. I cared a lot about the company they kept. I wanted them to hang out with good kids, people who would shape their character in positive sorts of ways. So, partly I think about how will this book shape you? But I also think that good people can write bad books, and that bad books are books that oversimplify the world, that give a false picture of reality, that flatten out humanity. And so I'm drawn towards complicated books, because I think we live in a complicated world. And I think a lot of this, we don't have to put these authors up on pedestals to keep them in the classroom. We can talk about how deeply flawed this person is, and this fall I'll bring in Sherman Lexie's apologies, and hopefully it'll be clear to anybody in that class that this is not okay.
One of the things I'm hearing from both of you is that this may be an opportunity, a teaching opportunity, that this certainly will inform how you introduce authors and books, but even the conversations that you'll frame the works with. And I'm wondering, is that an opportunity that you look forward to? What are some of the dangers of those conversations that you might anticipate?
I feel like one of the possible dangers is the line between understanding and becoming. Because if you're presenting a quote-unquote bad text to somebody about like racism or something like that, then there are kids in that class like, why are people so evil? Why do people do these things? I don't understand it. Okay, look at some of the things that this author is saying throughout the text, and then other people that are like, oh, I want to be like that. I want to have that power. So I feel like it depends on the person as well who's reading it. It depends on what you're bringing to the table, what you're bringing to the text.
Yeah, and I think for the teacher, there's a real onus on us to shape that conversation. I don't think we can be neutral. There are questions of virtue here on which objectivity is not called for, right? Compassion is something we can stand for, and intolerance and bigotry are things we can stand against. I did see an article the other day on Sherman Alexie, written by a teacher on an Arizona reservation. And you mentioned earlier The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and how she discovered this book, and how she had students who had not been engaged by literature at all, and found that book and found a model for who they could be in the central character in that book. And then the revelations came out about Sherman Alexie. And for me as a college teacher, I want to engage those controversies about his character and make it part about what we think about. But she chose not to. She said he's too important. What he's offered as a role model for these students, as a way of being in their world, is too important to pull the plug on it by exposing his character to them. I don't know, how do you think of that as a future high school teacher?
I'm trying to think of the word. When you come from like childhood and into adulthood and you're like, oh my gosh, these are realities that I have to face. This is what the real world is. By not recognizing the dualities of good and bad in people, we're setting ourselves up to these extreme expectations that are causing so many issues, anxiety, depression, and among a plethora of other things. What are we doing to kids when we tell them that all these people are perfect people? What are they going to do with themselves when they're like, I'm not perfect, I just cursed the other day. What am I going to do? Sherman Alexie doesn't curse.
One of the issues you brought up earlier, Katrina, was this idea of celebrity and social media, I think you mentioned. And I'm wondering, is this a dilemma of our contemporary era? The role social media, celebrity culture play in widening this issue. Is this a modern dilemma? And have we become almost sort of numb to, here's an author I love. Oh, I wonder what's going to come out about them. What role does social media play in this? And how might that affect these authors? And whether they continue to write?
It's pretty clear we live in a different world in terms of what we know. When I was in grad school, I remember occasionally in class, you'd have some professor who'd study very, very deeply on some author, perhaps a relatively obscure author, and he could draw on these little anecdotes that nobody knew. And they were often rather salacious, There was the bad things they did. And the joke in grad school was, we could use a class in literary gossip because these little tidbits are so tantalizing, It's like, ooh, really? We can make students sit up and take notice because of the bad things these authors did. Well, even in the 30 years since I've been in grad school, that the attractiveness of that has probably flipped. But you're certainly right that there's intimate knowledge available now that at one time would have been, we wouldn't have had to worry about. But yeah, this is the world we need to wrestle with, right?
So going forward with this issue, what is lost if we remove problematic authors' texts from the classroom and from library shelves? We've seen that happen too. We've seen organizations, I'm thinking of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who used to have an award named after her and now doesn't. But, do we lose something? Do we lose a tradition if we say, well, we can't go with these authors? Alexi, not part of our high school curriculum anymore. There are others. What do we lose?
I feel like we lose a piece of reality, a piece of history, and we lose the even attempt to understand why people are the way they are if we completely cut them out of our lives.
I like something you said earlier, Katrina, about this sort of danger of this oversimplification of good and evil. There are good people, there are bad people. In reality, almost everybody, well, not almost, everybody's somewhere on that spectrum of good and evil. I think we do need to ask about, what's the impact of maintaining, this person, attention to this person. Now, our students will encounter them first as texts, and primarily as texts. I think if the text promotes ways of thinking or promote a worldview that we don't want our students to take on, then that text should go. And I think, Michele, your example of Dr. Seuss, which has become a kind of cartoonish vision of this from some people who are going, oh my gosh, we're canceling Dr. Seuss now. It's totally legitimate to look at what, so this is, what is it, Mulberry Street?
To think that I saw it on Mulberry Street.
Right. Right, and say, do we want to continue those visions? Mm-hmm. But that we can also then distinguish between that and one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, and go dogs go, and we can keep those that aren't likely to perpetuate stereotype or anything like that. It all means we just need to think more deeply than maybe we thought we could do a decade ago or a generation ago.
Well, and I wonder too, does that put more of the onus on educators? As English teachers, we've long known that in addition to being literary, we also have to be history teachers, sociologists sometimes, psychologists. So, in terms of framing this for our students, it seems like there's an opportunity, but also a huge responsibility to sort of get this right and have those conversations. One question, I don't know if this sort of fits into this conversation where we're at right now, but does whether you feel an author is problematic depend to a certain degree on gender, age, ethnicity? John, you and I are sort of from the same generation, came through grad school, with those being told that these are sacred texts by Hemingway, Fitzgerald. You must read these. You must read John Dos Passos. And so I don't know how that might influence our frame of reference differently from someone who, is coming from a different point of view, a different worldview. Thoughts on that?
I was always taught never to judge a book by its cover, and I try to relay that into authors as well. I try to give everybody a fair chance as long as I actively read the text. I feel like we should never sit down and just absorb all the information from a text and take it as the gospel truth. We need to actively read because these are flawed people that we are receiving information from.
And I think for those of us in our demographic, Michele, we need voices like Katrina's. right? We need to create an atmosphere in which students can let us know what they experienced in reading that text. It's a question I try to start class with fairly often, and I think it sounds, to some people, it sounds sort of frivolous, like, boy, haven't you really thought of anything to say about this? But it'll be a question something like, what was that like reading that text for you? And I want to know that, because I realize the perspective I bring to it may not be the perspective others bring at all. I think we've made progress in demystifying authors, taking them off the pedestal. I think in the modern classroom there are more things that are up for grabs and subject to debate. I try to make sure that students always realize from the get-go that my syllabus was not handed down by the gods on Mount Parnassus or anything. That it's an artifact of ways that I think, stuff that I've read, sometimes stuff I haven't yet read but think should be good for us to talk about, and to just try to make that visible. And so even these difficult conversations about Sherman Alexie or Hemingway or whoever it might be, I think can be really fruitful in that regard. And hopefully freeing students to be able to say, I know that generations of people have thought this is wonderful for me to read, but that's not how I experience it.
I do think students teach us. And it reminds me of a couple of years ago in an adolescent literature course, I had introduced a story by Nadine Gordimer that I just loved, and I thought it was wonderful, and the students just hated it. They said, there's stereotypes in there, and I was just like, I didn't see that. So I was very grateful that the students had shown me that a different way of reading the story from a different perspective, a different voice, and that. So I welcome that in the classroom. I love that when we sort of open up by saying, "What do you think? How was reading this?" And the surprises sometimes from these other perspectives is wonderful. Yeah. So, anything else? Any other aspects of the issues that you'd like to discuss?
Well, I think the conversation we've had, as I've really appreciated, I appreciate what you've shared, Katrina, and I hope it can be a model for a middle ground. This seems so clear cut to people on both sides so often, it seems, right? Obviously, it's complete nonsense to censor anything, to question anything written by the great Dr. Seuss. I have wonderful memories of him. I loved reading him to my children. These people are obviously, they've lost their minds. Well, maybe not. Or the other side, that there's this kind of third rail that if you said something out of line, if you lived in a way that we can't admire, well, you're done. I'm sorry, I can't. It's I think, a false view of human nature to expect that. So I think as we've talked about this, it's felt difficult to me to find that balance, and maybe that's as it should be.
What I've heard from both of you today is this idea of practicing compassion and recognizing the flaws in the writers, the flaws in characters, which I think is a great starting point to realize that if you're compelled to tell a story, through writing, chances are you're flawed to begin with. Not that gives people a pass, but to understand and to sort of use that as a way to open conversations, I think is the way to go. Well, I'd like to thank Dr. John Barz and Katrina Owensby for your wonderful and lively discussion, and to the Wendt Center for this opportunity. I think we'll continue the conversation throughout the semester.
Thank you, Michele McKinlay, Jonathan Barz, and Katrina Owensby for your discussion today. You've given us much to think about and much to be challenged by. We appreciate your contributions and thank you for what you've done for us today.